Mr. President, we share the sense of being on a historic mission. Sino-U.S. relations have reached a new beginning. China and the United States are great countries. Friendly cooperation between our two peoples is bound to exert a positive and far-reaching influence on the way the world situation evolves.
China, ancient land, fabled land, a country that gave mankind the compass, gunpowder, paper, and the use of silk, a nation that for centuries sealed itself off from the outside world. Following World War II, the legions of Mao Zedong write a new chapter in China's troubled history. Proclaiming a communist philosophy and promising a mightier, more prosperous nation, Mao's armies sweep like a red tide across the countryside and into the cities, routing the nationalist forces of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. In 1949, victory is won, and Mao Zedong announces the establishment of the People's Republic of China. A bamboo curtain drops around a quarter of the world's population. Chiang Kai-shek is forced to flee to the island of Taiwan, where he sets up a Chinese government in exile. The United States continues to recognize Chiang and his nationalist government, providing military assistance to Taiwan and promising to help defend the island from attack by the Red Chinese. 1950, United Nations forces come to the aid of South Korea when it is invaded from the north. Red China enters the war and more than 50,000 Americans die, and another 150,000 are wounded. In July 1953 at Panmunjom, North Korean and UN officials sign an armistice that ends the bitter fighting. Taiwan becomes an island stronghold for the Chinese nationalists. Through the 1950s, Secretary of State Dulles is the symbol of America's support of Chiang Kai-shek and refusal to recognize communist China. The American 7th Fleet cruises the waters between Taiwan and the mainland. The U.S. military presence maintains an uneasy status quo between the two Chinas. Asked about returning to the mainland, Madam Chiang Kai-shek says,
"It thus strikes us as strange to be asked, as we are so often asked, do you expect to return to mainland China? If a member of one's community should be forced from his house by lawless elements, if most of his belongings are seized, and if some members of his family are held captive in the house, would one ask him, do you want your house back someday? Yes, we believe we will go back."
Behind the bamboo curtain, Mao undertakes a great leap forward. Family life is abolished. Men and women 14 to 50 are organized into communes where their activities are in response to bugle calls. The results are chaos. Chinese farmers lacking modern technology plant the wrong crops. They sow too early and too deeply. They exhaust the soil, and production, instead of going up, goes down. The most primitive means of irrigation are used as Mao Zedong dismisses scientific agriculture as useless superstition. And so, with 25 times as many farmers as America, grain production barely exceeds the U.S. output. For workers in factories and on assembly lines, salaries average an estimated $30 a month, compared to $250 in Russia and $1,100 in the United States. Oil production in China is less than a quarter of that in America. Again, the need is for management skills and up-to-date equipment. Lacking industrial know-how, much of the country's coal reserves remain untapped. Should abundant manpower be harnessed to modern technology, the People's Republic could become a leading industrial power. But with limited ties to the outside world, advances in education, science, and technology are slow. The lack of cultural exchanges, the restriction on the free flow of ideas, limit the nation's growth. In Moscow in 1956, a dramatic development that divides the communist world and brings the Russian bear and Chinese dragon into open conflict. Nikita Khrushchev denounces Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong's longtime idol, and speaks of peaceful coexistence between the free and communist worlds. In Peking, reaction at first is restrained, but as time passes, Mao Zedong becomes more outspoken, more critical of Moscow's brand of communism. The dragon and the bear square off to see who is number one. The United States is sharply critical of Mao when Chinese troops march into neighboring Tibet and set up a puppet regime there. Relations are strained further when Mao supports Ho Chi Minh during the Vietnam War. Ironically, 15 years later, China will turn on Vietnam when it becomes a close ally of Russia. At the United Nations, America and her supporters are able in the 1960s to block the admission of Red China.
No delegation in this debate has been able to refute what is in fact undeniable, that Communist China does not meet the requirements clearly set out in Article 4 of the Charter for participation in this organization. Both in words and in deeds, Communist China rejects the commitment required of member states to settle their disputes by peaceful means and to abandon the use or threat of force in international relations.
In the early 1960s, American and communist officials meet in Warsaw, Poland, in a futile attempt to find ways of resuming normal diplomatic relations. By 1971, there are enough communist and third world countries in the United Nations to expel nationalist China from membership. The action is angrily denounced by the delegate from Taiwan.
We shall continue to struggle with the like-minded governments for the realization of the ideals upon which the United Nations was founded, but which the General Assembly has now betrayed. We are confident that the cause for which we have been fighting for more than a quarter of a century will in the end prevail.
All that remains is for the roll call vote that grants the People's Republic of China a place in the World Organization. Loud applause greets the completion of the balloting and the announcement of the results.
The result of the voting is as follows: in favor 76, opposed 35, abstention 17. The draft resolution adopted.
Nationalist China, the first country to sign the UN Charter, is now the first member expelled. Next, a dramatic about-face in Sino-American relations. Secretary of State Kissinger makes a secret trip to Peking and arranges for President Nixon to visit mainland China. February 1972. 22 years of hostility end as the presidential plane arrives in Peking. Some observers believe the Nixon trip during a presidential election year is politically motivated. Peking's response, they say, reflects a deepening division between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic. Whatever the reason, the leaders of the two superpowers explore the road to reconciliation. President Nixon and Chairman Mao acknowledge basic differences between their two countries, but at the same time agree to work toward normalization of relations. September 1976, death claims Mao Zedong. The prophet, teacher, guide, and architect of the People's Republic of China has outlived Chiang Kai-shek by a year. Women and men, young and old, mourn the leader who shaped their lives and directed their destinies for more than a quarter of a century. A political moderate, Hua Kuo-feng, is chosen to succeed Mao as Communist China enters a time of testing from within and without. January 1979, Deputy Prime Minister Deng Xiaoping comes to Washington as the United States, after 30 years, severs ties with nationalist China and opens diplomatic relations with the People's Republic. VIPs at the welcoming ceremonies on the White House lawn hear President Carter say,
"Today we take another step in the historic normalization of relations which we have begun this year. We share in the hope which springs from reconciliation and the anticipation of a common journey. We expect that normalization will help to move us together toward a world of diversity and of peace."
Purged by Mao in 1966 and paraded through Peking wearing a dunce cap, Deng was restored to power, purged a second time, and reborn again. President Carter calls Deng's visit one of the most historic in our nation's history. A highlight of the Washington visit is a gala performance at the Kennedy Center. Singer John Denver, pianist Rudolph Serkin, the Joffrey Ballet, and the Harlem Globetrotters are among the featured performers. The 74-year-old Deng, a basketball fan himself, is delighted by the acrobatic antics of the world-famous magicians of the court. On a more serious note, Deng and Carter sign a series of agreements on cooperation in science, technology, space, and cultural exchanges. Through trade and aid, the People's Republic seeks to increase industrial output and raise its standard of living. America, in turn, looks to a vast new market for its exports.
For too long, our two peoples were cut off from one another. Now we share the prospect of a fresh flow of commerce, ideas, and people, which will benefit both our countries.
A new beginning in U.S. China relations.